from the University of Warwick, a very good university, University of Warwick. She then gained a PhD in concrete durability from the University of Liverpool. She has lived with her family in Glasgow since 1989, working variously as a materials lecturer in further education, as a research administrator, and until 2017 as an elected city councillor. That was in Glasgow, was it? Yeah. Now retired from all that, her interest in promoting STEM careers for girls has led her to become an independent researcher, mainly specialising in the history of women in engineering. She's a deacon of the Incorporation of Hammermen of Glasgow for 2022 to 2023. So welcome, Nina, to Sheffield. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. So just to clarify, the deacon of the Hammermen of Glasgow is the equivalent of Cutler. Also happens to be a woman, and who stupidly I didn't think of in enough time to try and make contact so that she and I could have had a wee blether. My own fault for not planning things.
Okay, they just go to sleep. No, it just goes to sleep.
Can we get rid of that bottom bar?
Yes, it will go away in a minute. It should just drop down.
Right.
They don't see it online.
So will this work?
You try it now.
Okay.
That line usually stays there, John.
Yeah, it stays there on this side, but basically they don't see it online.
Oh, well, I just hope nothing important's underneath it. Okay.
You can move it to the top.
Okay, so when I started to put this talk together, it was sort of loosely based on a terribly short one I gave some years ago about women in electrical engineering. But of course, I immediately realised that I can't come to Sheffield and not start with the story that's in Sheffield itself, which is, of course, the Wolf Safety Lamp Company. And I will talk about the woman involved in a minute. I will tell you what happened to me today. I thought I have enough time between getting off the train, meeting a friend for a cup of coffee, and having to be at the hotel and then getting here. I will go out to the Wolf Lamp Factory and pay my homage. So I get there, take my photographs, ring the doorbell, and a very nice lady comes out and says, yes. I explain, I'm an engineering historian, I'm giving this talk, and guess who's going to be the first person I talk about? And he says, our Monica, do come in. Now, you're talking about visits. They have a museum. It's not open at the minute because they're just redecorating the room that it's in. So I couldn't see it, but they do have a museum that can be visited. And I knew that there was a book, because I'd seen it advertised online, and I thought, well, rather than pay the postage on what's clearly going to be a heavy book, I'll ask if they've got a copy I can buy. Here it is. I haven't, of course, read it, so what I'm about to say, probably missing all sorts of amazing things that are in here, but it's lots of lovely pictures. Fantastic. What a day.
I have a copy of that.
And then getting the taxi from the Royal Victoria to here, taxi driver, his granny was the last of the women of steel. Sheffield has really brought everything out to me. What a fantastic day. Anyway, so here is the Wolf Factory, and here is one of their older types of safety lamp. Looks a lot like a Davy safety lamp, and that miners' lamps continue to look like that, regardless of how they were fueled for a long time. It was founded in 1888, originally in Leeds, and at that point they were just agents selling stuff that was made in Germany by Freeman and Wolf Company. And it wasn't going so terribly well, and eventually William Morris bought it up, the whole UK business, and moved it from Leeds to Sheffield. He'd had a long previous career, both with Davis, making Davis lamps, and also as a mine manager. So he really knew both sides of the work, both from the mining side and from the lamp side. And in 1916, they moved from South Street to where they are now. And in 1934, they were now in Saxon Road in the building they're still in. And if you go in that door there, you're immediately faced with the rest of the factory, people making things, boxing them up and selling them. Of course, nowadays they make all kinds of safety equipment, not just lamps. Oh, right. The green light needs to be on. Okay, right.
This is the problem with the very poor internet connection here.
Oh,
Yeah.
Just
It's the poor internet connection. It's just
okay.
we
So here we have Monica Morris, William's daughter. He had a son, but it was the daughter that was interested. So to begin with, she worked kind of in the office. She was a secretary, but she was clearly technically capable. And although she never went to university, he had her trained up in the factory. He sent her over to Germany. She spent over a year in Germany at Freeman and Wolf's learning the business. She worked in the drawing offices. She worked in the laboratories there, workshops and the foundry, learning all the aspects of how these things are made. And that was in about 1930. And between then and the outbreak of the war, she was backwards and forwards to Germany a lot, eventually representing her father on various international bodies that were considering international standards for miners' lamps. In 1932, she became a director and was in charge of planning of the work and planning of supplies to the various mines. And goodness knows, there must have been thousands in Britain at the time. And they were making all sorts of different kinds of lamps. Here's a poster of their acetylene lamps, but they had flame lamps, acetylene lamps, all kinds of fuels being used. The early safety electrical lamps came in during this period. She was attending these international standard conferences almost up to the outbreak of war. In 1938, she became the first, she became the first female member of the Association of Mining Electrical Engineers, and she also got married to Mr. Arthur Jackson. And sometimes you see her referred to as Helen Monica Morris and sometimes Helen Monica Jackson. The firm is still run by one of her sons. Perhaps I should actually go back, yes. So in World War II, she was on a British Standards Committee on mining lamps and safety wear. And in 1947, bearing in mind all that time she spent in Germany before the war and her good, very competent knowledge of technical German, she was one of a tiny number of women who were sent on the operation and surgeon teams. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, more easily not known as BIOS, was running during the war, and as soon as the Allies started to move successfully across Europe, BIOS teams were embedded with the advancing army to a greater or lesser extent. So, for instance, we were discussing earlier my interest in women in aviation science. Hilda Lyon went there at the very end of the war with a team from the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Monica Morris went a bit later in 1947 with a team looking at the lamp industry. And I only discovered just a few days ago in putting this together that there was another woman on her team, not in Charlie Hall's excellent book about this whole exercise of gathering information about industry and armaments and nicking as much technology as possible. So this other woman who had not really heard previously, a woman called Helen Megor, who was a crystallographer, was on the same trip with Monica Morris. So she had 3 patents, jointly with other inventors, but in her own name. Her father had patents before her. So this one is from 1953, and it's a flame safety lamp, spark ignited from an enclosed high tension generator. So the this is the base of the lamp, and one compartment has the magneto in it to make the spark, and the other compartment has the fuel. And there was still, I mean, to her dying day, she thought that the flame safety lamps were the best safety things for miners, because they were so sensitive to the behavior of mine gases.
It's on how to electrocute your wife or something like that.
So this is the so this is the next one, 1963. This is a spirit or gas burning lamp. Now we've moved away from magnetos. Now we're in the land of piezoelectric sparks. So this is a piezoelectric spark generator operated by a lever and a cam to increase the pressure on the crystal. Somewhere in amongst all this lot. And you can see this little handle is clearly what you crank to make the crystal do its thing and make a spark. And finally, in 1964, something that you all very likely have used, a piezoelectric igniter for a gas stove. You have them handheld and you have them built in. This is obviously a built-in one of some kind. I found this, Google showed me a picture of a Wolf gas stove igniter. But this was the patent that she took out in 1960. Well, it says 62, but it was finalized in 64. So these were her own designs. In 1951, when her father died, she took over the firm completely. And they diversified into lots of other things that were not just miners' safety lamps, which was just as well when you think about what was about to happen to the mining industry over the next few decades. They made all sorts of safety equipment. Here's a nice drill if you're that way minded, that's on eBay. And here are some examples. This is a hanging wandering light, a handheld torch for modern production. And I realized when I was looking at some of these pictures that they seem awful familiar to me. As was explained in the introduction, when I left school, I was in the Merchant Navy. I was deck officer in the Merchant Navy, and I did my training and first roles as a qualified officer with BP tankers. And I'm sure we had some of this equipment. These torches particularly looked so familiar. I'm sure that was the brand that we had when I was working on oil tankers. And they also sell other people's equipment. They do a sort of full range of equipment that is safe in explosive environments, including things that they don't make themselves, but they sell them on. So on their website, they have Venturi fans. Again, I can remember using Venturi fans on oil tankers to vent the gas out of tanks, pneumatically driven. Everything has to be as spark free as possible. So an interesting woman you will see in this picture of her. This is a modern colorized picture of her, but she had the most amazing style. Her clothes were always staggering. When she got married in 1938, she had a dress made her own design in bright red. Now, you didn't get married in red back in the day, but her clothes, they donated, her family donated a selection of her clothes and hats to the V&A. And if you go onto the V&A's online, exhibition kind of thing, you can look for her name and find some of her clothes, including the red wedding dress. She was always very stylistic. And when you think, she was always the only woman in the room, it's probably a really good trademark. I sell fantastic equipment and I look great, and you're not going to forget me, are you? So now, back to where this sort of talk more generally starts, back in time. And the title of the talk, of course, was about the electric arc. Here we have Bertha Ayrton, nice new plaque, 1854 to 1923. And she is known particularly for her work on the electric arc. She was very well educated from a middle-class family. She did maths at Girton, who of course wouldn't condescend to give a woman an actual degree. So she then went and quickly did one at University College London. And she thought it was very difficult for a woman to do anything useful with a maths or science degree. And she taught for a while, but she also earned a living to some extent by publishing mathematical problems, you know, like the little things that are in the back of New Scientists and this kind of thing. And another person who held a number of patents. So here is her 1885 patent for a line divider for engineering or architectural draftsmen. She also took out a number of other patents for line dividers, which were financially supported by female friends of hers. It's not clear to what extent these were actually available to buy, but the cost of getting the patent were covered by some of her aristocratic lady friends who thought that they deserved to be covered by a patent. But what she's really known for is the work that she did after she married Professor William Ayrton, who was a real hero amongst what we now call allies of women in engineering. He supported his wife's work to the nth degree, and we're very lucky that's the case. So here's a diagram from her 1899 paper on the reason for the hissing of the electric arc. Now, I think you're all of an age when you know what I'm talking about, but just in case there was anybody not of an age, I brought you some carbons to pass around. This is what I'm going to be talking about. These are carbon electrodes from electric arc lights. Both one of them says Birmingham and the other one says Apostle. I don't know who the Apostle company was. I can't find. Grace's guide is not obliging. These are both found on the beach at the Isle of May in the Firth of Forth, where a lot of this kind of lighting was used in the wartime. So she was looking at why does the electric arc hiss? And the explanation here, there can be no shadow of doubt that the sudden diminution of PD that accompanies the hissing of the open arc is due to the oxygen in the air getting directly at the crater and combining with the carbon at its surface. It only remains to show how the actual hissing sound may be produced by the burning of the surface of the crater. The moment this burning begins, a cloud of gas formed of the products of combustion must spread over the crater, protecting it momentarily from the action of the air, as effectually as the carbon vapor had hitherto done. When this gas is dispersed, the air will again come in contact with the crater, a fresh cloud will form, and the whole action will start de novo. Thus, a series of rushes and stoppages of the air will take place, setting up an irregular vibration of just the kind to cause a hissing noise. Her next paper was in 1901 and was extremely well received because up to this point, everybody and their cousin was making use of the electric arc for lighting and what have you, but it wasn't really clearly understood how it actually worked. And she did a whole lot of both very detailed practical experiments and theoretical thinking about what might be happening. And she showed that previous theories, which relied on some mythic build-up of a large back EMF, were completely wrong. That no self-induction was needed for the volatilization of the combustion materials. Only the positive pole of the arc volatilizes, And if I can we, no, sorry, never mind. So you can't see, but here, where it says letter A, that is a purple mist of combustion products. There is B, which is called the shadow, and C on the outside is a green flame. And the current flows through the vapor and the mist, but not through the flame, which has a very high resistance to the arc. She then examines the high temperature produced at the crater. So the crater up inside there. How the vapor film digs down into the positive carbon, why the negative carbon burns away. The effect of arc length, how the true positive resistance drops faster than the current increases, and the effect of coring of either or both carbons. I've only got one end of these are the consumed ends of the carbon. I haven't got the other ends to know what they look like. So, and as a result of all this work, and this is one of many graphs showing what was going on. So we can see different ampere levels, hissing point again. As a result of that, she took out some patents as well. And it was important because arc welding was going on even then and still is today. Arc lighting, this is a very early example of arc lighting, and we still use it today. This is a projector of some kind. And no, I haven't got a picture of her patents. So she took out quite a number of patents on the designs of the actual carbons, including ones that had concentric rings of different structured types of carbon running through them to try and deal with the pitting that she was finding. An alignment mechanism for holding the carbon, arc lamp enclosure structures, and various electrode holders as well. Again, I don't know if any of these were put into production by anybody. My guess is probably quite a lot of that kind of thing was going because arc lamps and the use of the electric arc was so important. Probably quite a lot of patents on the subject. So Hertha Ayrton is considered, despite the fact that she doesn't have an engineering degree, is considered to be one of Britain's earliest women to contribute intellectually to engineering. Sorry, can I move the bar down?
Yeah. Just,
Is it just drag?
yeah, just grab.
Oops. Okay, so and now a little interlude of some international women. This is Florence Violet Mackenzie, generally known as Mrs. Mac, Australian lady. She wanted to study electrical engineering at Sydney Technical College. They were kind of just about willing to admit a woman, but they had a cast iron rule. They only admitted students who were working in the relevant industry so that they could get the practical experience. In fact, this is often a problem even today in women who want to work on tools. A lot of FE colleges really need you to be employed by somebody so they can be sure you get the practical experience. And that's not always easy in some industries. So what she did, she didn't know anybody, certainly wasn't, it wasn't her father who was going to help. So she went out and she set up, and she was like 17, set up an electrical repair business, bought some business cards, got a little shop, and started work. She'd spent most of her childhood tinkering and kind of knew what she was doing, but she hadn't had any training at that point. At that point, Sydney Technical College would take her on, and she duly qualified. But by the time she'd finished that course, she not only had a thriving business, she was running Australia's first practical electrical engineering magazine and was really well known. She was the first Australian woman to get an amateur radio license, and she was instrumental in setting up the Electrical Association for Women in Australia. And we'll come back to the Electrical Association for Women here in a bit. But she set up, this is their cookery book. Fortunately, a few pages are available on Sydney's, I'm going to say City Archives or something. And here is a picture of the Electrical Association for Women's meeting rooms. So she was instrumental in setting that up. But what she's really known for was teaching Morse code. She taught to female aviators before the Second World War. She set up the Women's Emergency Signalling Corps, again, just before the Second World War. She went to the Australian Navy and said, I can train women to be naval signallers if you would care to set up an Australian version of the Wrens. Oh no, they said, I don't think we want women in the Navy. So she said, oh, fine, I'll go to the Air Force. And they changed their minds. And they set up the Women's Australian Naval Service, and she trained them. She believed to have trained 12,000 men and women in Morse. She never charged for these courses. She ran this little school in some upstairs rooms, never charged them. It was all funded out of her husband's not very large income. And the classes continued after the Second World War. She trained airline pilots, she trained merchant navy officers, hundreds, thousands of them. And this very murky picture, which has done that thing that old pictures do of losing certain colour bands, this is a whole load of her former students, mostly airline pilots, holding a party for her to celebrate and to say thank you for their careers. In India, we have Mrs. Lalitha. Her father was an electrical engineering professor at College of Engineering at Guindy. She married quite young, and by the age of 22 was widowed. Of course, it was very hard for a woman to be a widow in India, but her father was amazing. He supported her to go to this college as the first woman anywhere in India to go to an engineering college and do engineering. She graduated in 1943 in electrical engineering, and then it's a bit like what I was saying earlier about the problem about getting practical experience that Mrs. Mack had a problem with. In order for your degree to be fully validated, you had to have a year's practical experience, which she didn't have. And somehow or other, she was able to get a place in the engineering workshops at Jamalpur Railway Workshops to complete her degree. Most of her career, she worked for Associated Electrical Industries, AEI India, later GEC and so on, designing power transmission equipment, substations, generators, and she did a lot of the electrical power design work on the Bakra Nangal Dam, which is one of the biggest in India. In 1953, she was admitted as an associate member of the IEE. She was involved with the Women's Engineering Society, and she attended the first and second international conferences of women in engineering and science, known as ICWES, which is, you see her here. And that same year, here she is in Britain, visiting one of the AEI factories here. And she had a full career. She retired in 1977. So a woman who'd had a very, admittedly middle class support, but even for a middle class woman to be widowed in India in the 1930s and 40s, very, very tough. There is a really good book by my friend Shantha Mohan called Roots and Wings, which has the full story of Mrs. Lalitha and the two other women who qualified at the same time in civil engineering, and some of the other very early women in Indian engineering. Highly recommend you can get that online. And turning now to Africa, and a rather sad story, a young woman about whom we don't know half enough. And if it wasn't for the blog on the Electrifying Women site, which Emily has written, which tells us a bit more about it, we know even less. So Miriam Mwanga, later Mrs. Sabagala, Ugandan, and she came to Britain and trained at Manchester Tech as an apprentice, a trainee apprentice at, again, AEI, formerly Metro Vix. And I have to say that Metro Vix history of supporting women engineers is second to none in Britain. A lot of pioneering women engineers in various fields had at least some experience of working for them. When she qualified, she went back to Uganda and worked for the Uganda Electricity Board, which we can see an advert for, at a time when everything, electricity was just coming to, outside the cities. It was a period, that independence period, modernizing, everything to do with electricity seemed to be the next big thing. So she was very much involved in the modernization of post-colonial Uganda. She set up something which I think probably died with her, called the Women's Technical Society of Uganda, about which we know absolutely nothing, because very sadly, she was killed in 1975, not all that long after she married and had a child. She was killed in a car crash. And we know almost nothing else about her, unfortunately. And even today, women's position in engineering globally, Africa still continues to have pockets where it's really hard for women. So looking now at our own travels in Britain to become electrified. So if what was happening in Uganda after the war was bringing electricity to more of the masses, that's the situation we were at in the 1920s and 30s. My father, a middle-class child in a middle-class family that certainly not poor, he grew up in a house with no electricity in Essex. So lots of places, especially rural places, had no electricity. And Margaret Partridge, who was a maths graduate from Bedford College, who did work in the First World War in a company that made searchlights, saw an opportunity, a business opportunity, and she set up Margaret Partridge's, well, I suppose we call her consulting engineer in the power supply business. And she offered her services to large country houses, small estates, small villages. I will come and build you a small power station. It'll be your power station, and I will wire your houses up directly to your power station. You can have street lights, house lights, maybe a cooker in your house. And amazingly, she was able to persuade 3 towns in Devon and 1 in Suffolk. So the Suffolk one is Bungay, and 3 Devonshire ones were Bampton, Cheriton Fitzplain, and Thorberton. And if you look at this one, we don't have dates for the Thorberton one, but that's Bampton in 1925, that's Cheriton Fitzplain in 1955. Okay, we can see telephone poles, but these towns, these villages really don't look very modern, even in that 30-year gap. rural Britain often didn't have much in the way of electricity, and she was able to persuade these places to take this on. She was director of Southwest Utilities in 1937, and she had a rather clever idea. It didn't really work in the end, but the idea was that in each location, she would try and find a girl from that county who had done quite well in maths and science at school, take her on as an apprentice. They would build the power station together. The girl would learn the business by wiring up in these houses. Then Margaret Partridge would move on, and the apprentice would be left behind to run the whole thing. Some of the time she worked with her lifelong friend, Margaret Rowbottom, and the apprentice for which this idea worked the best is this woman here, whom we know better in the aeronautical engineering line as Beatrice Shilling. So Beatrice Shilling was employed as a schoolgirl, school leaver, I suppose we'd say, and from day one had the real spark. And Margaret Partridge was amazed at how enthusiastic and capable she was. In contrast to, we've got Miss Kay Bunker, who is that one, who was apparently useless. Turned up for the interview with her mother and whines the whole time. But here we are, perpetrators of the original offence. And the original offence was committed by Beatrice, because the thing about power stations is they have to run 24/7. And there was a thing in force, an International Labour Organization, Washington Convention, which prevented women from working at night, particularly if they were working on their own, and Beatrice was, and she was caught and reported, and it caused a huge fuss. And this group of women, particularly Margaret Partridge and Margaret Rowbottom, but also Caroline Hazlitt, they campaigned for years to get that overturned. And initially, they only got as far as making it so that women who were in the sort of managerial line could work at night, still leaving it very difficult for other women to work at night. But they did eventually get the whole law changed. And here we have Margaret Partridge's plaque in Devon. When the two Margarets, Rowbottom and Partridge, retired, they retired to Margaret's old family home in Devon and organised the local village to electrify its own village hall. So they never stopped ploughing away at what needed done. Moving now to Mabel Matthews. Mabel Matthews has, well, a lifetime career with Consolidated Pneumatic Tool Company. We don't know when she started, and we know nothing about her education to speak of. We think probably she started with them during the First World War. There's a factory, and she was initially working on the sales side, but she became so technically competent that she ended up as managing director of the whole company and was admitted as an associate member of the IEE, despite having no degree. She wrote a paper, which here is in The Woman Engineer. She gave this talk, The Development of Women's Interest in the Domestic Uses of Electricity. And it was her idea that what was missing was an organization which would campaign to and for the housewife, to encourage her to feel comfortable using electrical appliances, because that was the way particularly wash day drudgery could be reduced. She looked at the lives of even middle-class women, because after the First World War, the servant problem never really resolved itself. Most people stopped having live-in servants very quickly, and the life of a housewife was hard. So she had this idea that if you persuade women to be comfortable with the technicalities of electricity and with the appliances, that it would make women's lives a great deal better. And Caroline Hazlitt, who had set up the Women's Engineering Society, agreed, because her thought was along very much the same lines of reducing the drudgery. So the Electrical Association for Women was set up in 1924. They held classes around the country for girls, some, I don't know, Girl Scouts or something, Girl Guides of some kind, having training lessons. They had classes for adult women, and typically if you took one of the classes, you learned how to change a fuse, wire a plug, you learned what was inside your cooker, inside your iron, inside your electric kettle, and usually your reward for attending one of these classes, which were delivered to people like the Seroptimists and Women's Institute and that kind of thing, was you got a tea towel. And these tea towels came in all sorts of different designs. And just about a week ago, the archives down in London, the Electrical Association for Women and Women's Engineering Society's archives are looked after by the IET. And they had an envelope through the post, anonymous envelope with a tea towel in it of a design we'd never seen before. So they've got as many as we can find of the original ones, and there's also, you can also get replicas of some of them have been made, which you can buy online. And of course, nobody wires a plug anymore, but within our lifetimes, that was an essential skill. You needed to know where the brown and blue went and all the rest of it. And so you had a handy tea towel to tell you what to do and how to change a fuse. There are other ones, there are posters about all the stuff that's inside an electric cooker and so on. The Electrical Association for Women also ran classes, well, provided the syllabus and the training materials for classes at domestic science colleges. So the Doe schools, as they're known in Scotland, they provided classes in the same sort of thing, how to use electrical appliances, what was inside, what the safety aspects were, how to change a plug and all the rest of it. And this book, the Electrical Handbook, was the textbook for those classes. And they were teaching people who were going to be future domestic science teachers in schools, and also women who were going to be electrical demonstrators in the enormous network of usually county council run electricity board showrooms around the country, which again existed in most of our lifetimes and have now disappeared. The other thing that they did was they provided the link between the consumer and the industry. So there was an easy route for the electrical power industry and electrical appliances industry to talk to housewives en masse and find out, what they thought about, the products and what they might need next. I mentioned Caroline Hazlitt. Caroline Hazlitt had been employed as the Women's Engineering Society's General Secretary. We call her a CEO now. And as soon as the Electrical Association for Women was being thought of, she took that and ran with that for most of the rest of her life. She got thoroughly involved in the industry. She was usually the only woman around, and she was on British standards panels. She was in the early nationalisation organisations, the British Electrical Authority, Central Electrical Authority, CGB. She was involved in all of those, advocating for safer appliances, and she was instrumental in the British safety plug. So here is the old BS 546 round pin plug, and here is the BS 1363 safety plug with the shuttered sockets. Nowhere else in the world has these. And we can thank Caroline, because she was determined that when British standards for electrical plugs and sockets are being designed, they should be safe so that kids couldn't electrocute themselves by sticking their fingers in the sockets. And I'm partly French, and my mother tells the story of one of her French cousins, boy cousins, coming over after the war and being a stupid macho French boy thought it was terribly funny because he'd do this at home as a party trick to stick his fingers in the socket, which in France is more or less safe enough. And here he's lucky to have got away with his life. And that's because we've made these sockets safe so that people can't really do that. You've really got to try to get your fingers in the socket because you've got to push the shutter aside. And we can thank Caroline Hazlitt for a lot of that. And here we see her posed with various bits of electrical stuff, which is the sort of thing that they would have been doing at these classes, the housewives. So the Electrical Association for Women is a great success, and it's spawned almost immediately its gas-fired sister. So the Women's Gas Federation operated in exactly the same way. Membership groups all over the country, having meetings, having classes, producing a textbook, training up domestic science teachers. And the third sister in the group was not a membership group, but it was purely an advisory group, the Women's Advisory Council on Solid Fuel, which are all about coal-fired heating and cooking, at a time when vast swathes of the country, they might have electric light, but everything else was coal-fired in the house. So getting back to people who actually, did the practical electricity from day to day, here we have Dix Beam, who was the only female member of the Electrical Contractors Association. She took over her father's gas and electrical business in 1926. So we're talking about the same periods as these other women I've been mentioning. And in 1934, her biggest and most high-profile contract of the interwar years was the electrification of Winchester Cathedral. And this was such a big deal. This is all the papers. So, lady installs electric lighting in cathedral. Miss Jeannie Dix at work in Winchester Cathedral, where she's carrying out the electrical installations for light and heat. She won the contract in competition with famous British and continental firms. The Dean, the very Reverend Selwyn, says that the expert way in which she is carrying out her task will be the envy of every visiting electrical engineer. An appeal is made for funds to complete the heating and lighting, which will cost altogether £10,000, a lot of money. And here is a picture from the Illustrated London News of the floodlighting of a new ecclesiastical form, a cathedral interior, and that's the inside of Winchester Cathedral. She experimented personally. She and her workmen were up in, I suppose, in theatrical terms would be the gods, right up in the roof, experimenting with different kinds of lighting to see what would produce the best effect for this amazing altar backdrop. And famously, they had, in order to get the heating and cabling in under the floor of the nave, some graves had to be moved. You know how so many old churches have, you're walking on people's gravestones. And famously, they avoided having to disinter Jane Austen and were just able to sugar her to one side to get all the necessary infrastructure in. She was president of the local branch of the Electrical Industries Benevolent Association, so a well-known person. Her business was still going strong when she retired in 1960. She sold it to the staff for the price of £1. Unfortunately, it's not still extant, unlike the Wolf lamp example. Now, if I say here's a bit of light entertainment, please don't take this as a pun. This is a bit of absolute nonsense. Not an electrical engineer, but it's so bonkers I couldn't resist. So Beatrice Irwin was an actress from a middle-class background. Here you see quite a successful actress. Here you see her, can't remember what part she's playing now. But she was very interested in esoterica and theosophy, so between the wars again. And she joined the Order of the Golden Dawn. Here is Aleister Crowley being potty. The Order of the Golden Dawn was something, it seemed like a bit of a fraud. You know, you paid money and you advanced different levels, and presumably you believed in all sorts of strange ideas of magic and so on. a lot of middle class and upper class women were involved in this, arguably because they had nothing better to do. But through this, she got interested in what she described as the science of lighting, and believed that the new science of colour would influence all our souls. And she took out a patent, put her money where her mouth was. She took out a patent for a light filter, which you could use to produce these different lighting effects that were going to have some strange magical effect. I'm not quite sure how much actual science, let alone engineering, was involved, but so crackers I couldn't resist it. Now, moving on to the electronics side of things. And I sort of apologise in advance because all the women I'm going to be talking about were in defence electronics, which brings with it the problem of trying to find out what they actually did when everything they did was top secret. A few of them published papers, but not many. So starting with Winifred Hackett, BSc, PhD. She got her BSc from Birmingham in electrical engineering, and in 1931, her PhD on improved methods for commercial testing of watt meters. And I noticed we have a watt meter sitting in a cupboard over there. Her first commercial job was with the British Electrical and Allied Industries Research Association, this place here. There's their badge. One of a huge plethora of organisations supported by the government. So before even the end of the First World War, the government was concerned that there was, I'm going to say, almost a paranoia that German science and industry were more closely entwined than British science and industry, and that the Germans were technically ahead of us because they made better use of their science. And so whether or not that was true, and it is debatable, the government put a very serious amount of money into setting up government research establishments, and also what was called the Million Fund. So it's £1 million at 1918 prices. I can't remember what that might be now, but a lot of money. And any industry that could put together a mutual research association of members who paid a membership fee to the research association, they could have matching funds from the government. So a whole load of industries, from all sorts of industries, had these. And the industries that were not capable of doing it for themselves, so the construction industry and aviation, there were some government-run organisations like the Building Research Establishment and the Royal Aircraft Establishment. But the Electrical and Allied Industries, ERA, they employed her for a while. And then in the Second World War, she moved to back into actual industry, worked for A.H. Hunt capacitor and condenser manufacturers, and she was researching dielectrics, which is quite a bit of what she would do next. In 1947, she moved from H. Hunt's to English Electric, working at both Luton and Stevenage in their guided weapons division. And she was in charge of their first ever computer, the Deuce computer, which, I mean, we don't know who the women are, who any of them are, but that's what the Deuce computer looked like. And it worked variously off punch cards and punched tape. And she was in charge of the computer and of the programming of it for English Electric. At the time when they were designing guidance systems for Thunderbird, what is that? Thunderbird, this is at a test range, surface to air missile. In 1960, she moved to Manchester University Business School, where she was, again, largely to run the computer analysis side of the work they did there. And one of the projects she started out with was doing analysis of the workflow in aircraft production, which I mean, we're talking about 1960, but I mean, that was a sensitive topic even in the Second World War. So clearly they're still very concerned about the efficiency of that. And an interesting side note to that is that she was looking for an assistant. And the person she took on was Judy Butland, who had tried to do a maths degree and couldn't get along with being told what to do and when to do it as a maths student. And so only did the first year, but was absolutely brilliant. So at quite a young age, I think she was only 19 or 20, she came to work as Winifred Hackett's assistant. And they got on immediately because they were both of a mind to the person who needs whatever they're doing to be perfect and right first time. And they got on like a house on fire. And Judy went on, she was her protege, but she went on to some considerable success of her own because she realized that there was no easy way for academics to turn their reams of data into curves without doing it all by hand. And she devised a very simple early program called Simple Plot, which she and her husband marketed for years, and you can still get it. You can get versions of this as apps to your mobile phone. But it's a rather nice example of a woman towards the end of her career, giving someone who was really struggling to find her niche a way forward. And I should say Hackett was a president of the Women's Engineering Society, and so was Peggy Hodges, OB. Peggy got a string of letters after her name. It's interesting because as we go on, so people seem to get more and more of this. The early women were not even being admitted to many of those organizations, let alone being allowed to become, chartered engineers and so forth. Peggy is another one of these Girton graduates. She did maths at Girton. And well, actually, before she was even at Girton, she was too young to go when she finished school. She spent a year as a junior radio engineer at Standard Telephones and Cables. And it really stood her in good stead because they were working on instrument landing systems at the time, this kind of thing. And this is almost what she spent the rest of her career doing, in a sense. So she went to university, got her degree, got her PhD. Oh, sorry, I'm wrong person, not a PhD, got her degree, and then went to work for GC. And she was a microwave and systems engineer at the time when they were working on the Red Dean and Sea Dart missiles. And her particular skill was developing simulations so that they could test whether the guidance systems were working or not. So here we see sort of missile she was working on. And she also worked on the assessment of radome aberrations. So here is early radome on an aircraft, and here is a very straightforward diagram of a true target, apparent target seeker, the different things that can go wrong with a radar aerial inside a radome, and the effect of both the radome itself and external problems such as sea reflections. If you think about the sea when it's flat or when it's wavy, rippled, if you're trying to do, if you're trying to launch a missile at quite a low elevation, the bounce of the radar off the sea really matters if this is a radar guided missile. So she was working on, she was project manager of the Sea Dart guidance system. And she was on the Ministry of Aviation's panel on radome performance. And also she worked on underwater weapons. In 1970, she won this lovely object made by Barbara Hepworth, no less. That is the Whitney Strait Award for outstanding performance in aeronautics. And they don't give Whitney Strait Awards to just anybody. It's rather fine, isn't it? And I think this is a cartoon from her leaving card when she retired with various missiles. Moving on to Betty Laverick, also a woman who was president of the Women's Engineering Society in her day. Before she ever went to university, she worked at the Radio Research Station, which is this place here. We don't know what she was doing, obviously very junior, but at the time she was there, the Radio Research Station was investigating the height of the ionosphere layers. And they were doing this by firing shortwave radio pulses straight up to 100 kilometers and 300 kilometers to see where the ionospheric layers were. She went to Durham to do a wartime degree in physics and radio. So during the war, there were condensed degrees, often done in 2 years instead of 3, and in subjects of the government's choosing. If you chose to do one of these degrees, you had a full cover financially. So it was, you know, if you had the skills to do something like physics and radio, you would get grants in a way that was unusual before the post-war period. In 1950, she did a PhD on dielectrics, a lot of dielectrics going on in these stories. And in 1951, she moved to GEC at Stanmore, and she was another microwave engineer, also working on guided weapons, working on the Sea Slug. And the Sea Slug guided system is what's known as a beam riding guidance. So you send a radar beam out, the missile follows that beam. And the radar equipment in question for the Sea Slug is this Type 901 radar. And this is a picture of it on a fancy set of gimbals at Aberporth testing ranges, where they were trying out this kind of stuff on the Welsh coast. In 1954, she moved to Elliott's to work on radar there. And by 1959, she was head of their radar research. And in 1968, she was general manager of their automation and radar systems. And there's quite a long oral history recording transcript online. And she makes a comment that, you know, although she loved doing the technical stuff when she was younger, the challenge of actually managing those sorts of people was very exciting to her as she became more senior. In 1973, she took out this patent for a radio aerial. This is for a radio aerial using plane polarized radio waves for selective transmission. I have to say, electronics was my weakest subject when I did my engineering degree. So if you detect that I'm not getting very far into the text of these patents, you'll be absolutely correct. Because anybody else who wants to, well, the Defence Electronic History Society is very good at that kind of thing, but it's frankly well beyond my capacity. And my final lady for this evening, Betty Kick. This is her from her University of St Andrews graduating class. But before she ever took her degree, during the war, she was a Women's Auxiliary Air Force radar mechanic. And it's interesting, all these women had sort of various things happen to them very early on in their careers that seemed to set them on the path forever, regardless of, you know, through their degrees and all that, it's still doing related things later. So in 1951, she did a BSc in physics at St Andrews. And she was, interestingly, she was very connected to the university, and later on they gave her an honorary doctorate, and she continued to donate money almost up until she died. And they kept in touch. They visited her when she lived in the south, on the south coast by that point. They kept in touch with her quite closely. Her first job was with the Analytic Signals Establishment in the antenna division. So she was employed by the Royal Naval Scientific Service. And unfortunately, there were some some information on the internet which is wrong, which says she was in the RENS, and that's because they've got confused between the WRNS and the RNSS. So the Royal Naval Scientific Service is who she was employed by in the Admiralty Signals Establishment when they were working on this kind of thing. This is a set of slotted arrays, phase shifter with corner waveguides, and this is one unit of that. In 1966, she'd become senior for a woman in the Scientific Civil Service. 1969, she moved to the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment, this place here, Portland. And that year was the only time we have any really clear insight into her technical work, because she was permitted to go to a conference, European Microwave Conference, and there's a few of her papers available online from that. Otherwise, like most of these other women, everything is either behind commercial confidentiality or government top secretness. So we can only guess at a lot of the work that she did. She was the first woman to become a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. And in 1984, when she retired, she was Deputy Chief Scientific Officer at the Underwater Weapons Establishment, far and away the most senior woman in the Scientific Civil Service. If I think back to some of the women at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, their bosses were fighting tooth and nail to get them promoted past Principal Scientific Officer. Whereas Betty, who, another one of these people who didn't suffer fools at all, let alone gladly, and was famously extremely tough. And for the people who liked that style of management, they thought she was marvelous. Other people, you know, crumbled under the impact. But she was known to say to eminent people, I'm not even going to explain this to you, it's beyond you. The Americans, interestingly, she backed and forwards to the American defense establishments. Her irreverence, they loved it. Oh, the Brits are so relaxed, this is so amazing, because she was so rude about people who she thought were stupid. But you know, she was very demanding of her staff. And you hear this time and again about women, particularly in defence work. And it's true also of some of the women at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Very, very demanding. You know, you write a sloppy report and you will know all about it. But it meant that these sort of the younger staff coming through their hands had fantastic grounding that stood them in good stead for later. In her retirement, she retired to a place called Stoughton and got very involved in church history. And it was celebrating its millennium. I don't know when, I can't remember the date now. But she did all the research for a series of cross-stitch or embroidered panels that the church women made for their history. And when she died, she left some money to fix their roof. She was also very keen on sailing, apparently. That's all the individuals I'm going to be talking about. And you'll know that so many of the electronics engineers, we don't know enough about what they did because of the nature of the work, which, you know, may never emerge, might have been destroyed rather than, you know, kept in archives. A lot of them in defence work, and it's still the case. A lot of talented electronic engineers, women, end up in defence work. There's a huge number in what was EE, then Marconi, BAE, Leonardo, Celex. I can't remember what they call themselves now, but they're changing their names all the time. Lots of women seem to end up in this field and have good careers in it. So good luck to them. Now, I mentioned that the Electrical Association for Women was founded in 1924. So you will have detected, because you're all good at maths, that it's their centenary next year. And Graham Gooday and I are involved with a working group that is looking for ways to celebrate this in different ways. This is the preliminary logo, Electric Dreams, Festival of Woman Power. The idea is to do some work on the historical side, which is what I'm principally interested in, but also to link that to electrical efficiency and energy saving, and to opportunities for apprenticeships for young people today in electricity and electronics. And it has emerged that with the demise of the EAW and its like, the industry, the Association for the Manufacturers of Domestic Appliances, no longer have a direct route to finding out what the consumer wants. So we're thinking about ways that we might publicise both the centenary and facilitate perhaps industry having closer contact with its consumers. And I'm open to being contacted by anybody who might have contacts in local museums that perhaps have, a display. Here is a local kitchen from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, that we might approach and say, would you like to put up a little display about the Electrical Association in your social history bit alongside these nice appliances you're already demonstrating, you're already displaying. So if anybody knows of museums anywhere and would like to get in touch with us, we'd be interested to hear from you. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Very good.
What a wonderful, interesting talk. Well done. That was brilliant. Thank you. Nina's agreed to answer any questions that we might have.
Coming back to your arc lights, right? Where can we see one operational?
I'm trying to remember that one that. Let's see if we can get back to it. That one. I actually can't remember, but I can let your chairman know. That is some kind of I'm going to say it's not a cinema projector, but it's something like that, where you want a very intense light.
Still using carbon?
Good question. Doesn't look like it to me, but
Like an arc.
it looks like metal to me. I will try and find out what that exactly was.
Because I mean, apparently it's radio interference or something that causes problems, isn't it? Because I mean, you look at the modern lighting about, and you can see that some of them are modelled on street lighting is modelled on electric arc lights.
Well, I can't tell you what this is used for, but when I went looking online, I wanted to contrast the fact that we had the old one and a modern one. This is modern arc welding, old arc welding.
Yeah.
So I'll try and find that. I can't remember where I got that from now.
Thank you. I did work on women at Ferranti.
Oh,
It was quite clear that they were very early recipients of Electrifying Women.
fantastic.
What's your view about all these women that have gone into various defence companies? You know whether they
I
had
have no idea. In the civil service, it was a constant battle because the civil service grades until the law changed in 1970 or thereabouts. They were set up women's grades and women's grades and men's grades, and it was very difficult to get past that. I don't know very much about the Admiralty, defence, water establishment situation. I do know more about the Royal Aircraft Establishment, where the directors of each division were constantly battling against this, to the extent that they said, we're going to lose this amazing woman if we don't do something about this. Oh, well, give her a bonus that will bring her up to the male grade without actually putting her on the male grade. So in industry, I have no idea. probably really hard to find out. I mean, the women, we think about, you know, women who got right to the top, probably they could say what they wanted, but, you know, when you came in the 1950s and 60s, it was assumed that you were a woman, you didn't need as much. But I don't know the answer really.
Yeah, thanks. A comment, not a question, if I may. As we're on Hertha, you know the story that what everybody else accepted Hertha's work on the art was the best. The Admiralty did not. Anytime she had consultancy for them, they sent a check to her husband, not her. The question, I mean,
That's interesting, because if you think about completely unrelated field, Henrietta Vansittart, who designed the first propeller accepted by the Admiralty, they had no problem dealing with her, even to the extent of taking her out on sea trials. So I suppose admirals come and go, don't they?
well, I think with my test, sometimes her father had been an engineer.
Yeah.
Recognised, so Hertha didn't have that. But the question, I mean, just looking at what Hertha published, I mean, she's got extremely detailed observations. It struck me, maybe I should feel that she's just much more careful than anybody else on observing arcs. I mean, it's a painful business looking at them all day long now. She's almost astounded to do this. And also,
Well, I guess because it was, and she didn't have proper facilities either. But I mean, it's clear that by doing this detailed theoretical analysis and this very careful practical series of experiments, loads and loads of, she was able to show what nobody else could actually be bothered to find out almost.
Which high risk, isn't it?
Sorry?
Get melanoma in the result, but you.
Well, I couldn't have done your eyes any good. I don't know. I wonder if she wore, you know, like welder's goggles or something, smoked glass or something. You know, I've never seen that mentioned, but you know, it does occur to me that, you know, you're always told never to look at welding. So,
There's a comment online from
okay.
it's from Louise Sanger, and it's more by way of a thank you. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Nina. What a brilliant spread of skills and expertise. Electric dreams, brilliant idea for promoting new skills in industry. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Any other question from my colleagues here?
Comments?
Comments?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry to come in again. One issue that crops up in the current piece of research I'm doing, there's a very large number of female draftsmen.
Yep.
Again, better pay than men. Is this part of a surplus woman problem after the First World War? Because you know, there are large numbers of female draftsmen that were available in the 1930s.
Are we talking draftsmen or tracers?
No, we're talking draftsmen quite explicitly.
Interesting.
Because
this is a Ferrantes again.
no, this is engineering in London.
Huh. I hadn't heard that, and I tell you who'd be really interested, because they've been doing a special study of drawing offices and the people in them, and that's the Summerley Industrial Museum just outside Glasgow at Kirk Bridge. In fact, I'm going to see them soon to talk about what they're going to do for the Electrical Association of Women, but they were doing some research looking through their materials at both men and women working in the drawing offices on the Clyde side. I hadn't heard that there were a surplus of women anywhere in
No, I
drawing
mean,
offices.
because of the men being killed in the First World War, the women had to find gainful employment.
Sure.
Therefore, drawing offices, the drawing office offered an internal labour market, so they presumably moved in as tracers, became designers, and moved up to quite senior roles.
Well, I'm only aware of one so far, and I can't remember her name now, but there was a woman who had a complete career from before the First World War. She was retired after something like 50 years in the drawing office and rose to become the head of the drawing office. Very unusual. For women to be tracers was commonplace, but for them to rise up to the rank, that's a really, look forward to reading about that.
Suggests a third of the staff by 1942. Wow.
Well, in the war, I'm not surprised, but in the interwar period, I'm really surprised. So look forward to reading that. Is that going to be in the magazine soon?
I hope so, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, of course they'll accept it.
Just one complete off piece completely. Victoria Owens and her book. I sent her an email about 2 weeks ago that I found just by chance, and only by chance, in an archive in Warrington that I've been looked at for 60 years. Yes, there's a £9 invoice, was indeed run by a woman, Sarah Whitley.
Right.
So she had died after her husband died, and then she died 10 years later. So
Oh, well,
Charlotte Guest wasn't alone.
well, there are others, but definitely worth writing up, even if it's a snippet in links, just to get it recorded.
Develop on Bob's comment there. In civil engineering, it was very, very common for if their husband died or the wife to take over the contract. In fact, the GATS railway
Train, yeah.
in India, it went out. She was from, I'm sure she was a Knoll from Leeds, a well-established contractor.
Alice Treadwell.
It couldn't be a bit.
Yeah.
And
Her husband died almost immediately. They got
and then
there.
basically the wife takes over and runs the contract.
Yeah.
It's the only way of not going bankrupt.
Yeah.
And if you look at civil engineering in the period really from really 1850 to about the turn of the century, there are many examples of wives not just in a figurehead role, but basically taking over both the technical and financial management of contracts.
But the fact of the matter is, you know, if we think about brains going, Lady Moyer, who coined the phrase "engineer by marriage." So Emily Roebling was engineered by marriage. These are women who were not just, oh, off you go to your nice job, dear. They were paying attention to what was going on. You can't just take over if you don't know anything just because you happen to be the one. You've got to have been paying attention to not just the money, not just the admin, but the whole business.
Yeah, there's also the fascinating comment that's almost like a throwaway line in something that John Smeaton writes. He's talking about his daughters are the people who produce his drawings. So Smeaton's, what you see as Smeaton's drawings, as civil engineering, almost certainly are not his drawings. They're the drawings that were produced for him by his daughters from his sketches. And so he's, you know, going back, there's
a lot of interesting snippets.
Yeah.
Sorry,
There's a question.
Gentleman here in the orange top. I don't
I
know.
was just going back to the effects of carbon art on the body.
Yeah.
Some time ago, many years ago actually, in the summer, I was doing some carbon art raising, only wearing a thin shirt. And when I took the shirt off, later, my whole chest was bright red, apart from a white stripe straight up the middle where the buttons.
Oh my God. So
And that was,
nasty bit of sunburn then.
yeah,
Right.
really bad. But there's a thought, if you want to play with carbon art raising thought.
Yeah.
Mm.
Any more? If you're to select an engineer, woman engineer now in electrical, electronic engineering, who would you?
What, you mean somebody working now?
Somebody working now to put into your presentation to bring it right up to date.
I don't know. I mean, one or two that I know personally, but that wouldn't necessarily be representative of the most sort of amazing
No,
achievers. I don't know.
that's a wrong question.
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask, perhaps, because I don't really, on the whole, keep tabs on the women who are successful now. Sorry? I can't quite hear what you said.
The lady president of the mechanical engineer.
I don't know who that is now.
It was Pam Liversidge at one time.
Oh, well, that's a while ago, though.
It is, yeah.
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 I don't know. Sorry.
She was the first female president of the
Yeah, maybe.
Institute. And then Isabel Pollock came after. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much indeed. That was a brilliant talk. Really enjoyed that. Lots of information there. You must have spent a lot of time preparing the talk. So thank you. And David's going to give a vote of thanks. David Byrne.
Yes. Yes, Nina, I'd like to second David's comment there, but just give you a perspective on some of my experiences. And one's going back to the carbon arc and the many happy hours I spent fusing together thermocouples in a laboratory, where I work with a conduct on steel freak testing.
Mhm.
In all that time, and also the time I spent hearing that electric arcs welding up high test pipelines, I never heard of the name of, who was it, Monica Jackson?
No, Hertha probably.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, Hertha. And in all my career, I didn't hear much about women in engineering.
Well, I'll tell you what, we hardly hear about any history of engineering in our training, full stop.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when I reflect on that, I go back to the late 1960s and think to myself, in all that time, 50 years of work, very, very few references, have been made to women in science and engineering. Yet now, with STEM, with the chartered mechanical institutions promoting STEM and promoting women in engineering, it's certainly apparent that there is a move to promote women in engineering. And in fact, one initiative in the locality, I don't know whether you've heard of it, there's a local company that actually sponsored an event, or still sponsors an event, in Rotherham at the Magna Museum called Getting Up to Speed. And it's basically a STEM event with conducted on either 1 or 2 days in the year, with hundreds of school children, girls and boys, being shipped in to get involved in experiments concerning the plethora of engineering experiments. And I attended one of them, and it was absolutely superb. Yeah. And hopefully, that will, stimulate a lot of girls to take up engineering. And in particular, in one of the institutions I belong to, the Institution of Gas Engineers, there's a lot of focus on young people, young women in engineering, through the Young Engineers competition. And there are always 50% of graduates involved in this competition who are girls, with the gas and the electricity engineer, pushing girls forward into project engineering and project management and such like. It's very interesting, that's fun to see it. Maybe it's come a little bit late in the day, but one has to say that at least a lot is happening now. And from your presentation, and I'm sure a lot of people within the audience who subscribe to my group, it's been a long time coming. And it's good that you've done the research work and you can come to organisations like ours in order to present your view of these very successful women in important areas of engineering. So I'd like to, so that's the audience here, to thank you in Norway.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Thank you.